The elevator stopped at the 32nd floor of Grant & Locke Innovations, a towering glass and steel giant in the heart of downtown Chicago. It was 6:47 a.m., and the first rays of winter sunlight were beginning to stretch across the city skyline. Margaret Whitmore stood quietly in the HR waiting room, clutching a worn canvas bag and a manila envelope. Her fingers, gnarled by age and cold, pressed tightly against the folder that held her entire life in 11 pages, none of which she knew would impress anyone. Across from her sat a receptionist barely in her 20s, chewing gum and scrolling through her phone. "You're here for the janitor position?" the young woman asked without looking up. Margaret nodded, straightened her shoulders. "Yes, ma'am. Night shift. Full time." The receptionist eyed her skeptically. "We usually don't get applicants over 60. You sure you can manage this building? It's 40 floors. Cleaning crew has to rotate through stairwells, executive offices, utility levels. It's not light work." "I can manage," Margaret said simply. The HR manager arrived a few minutes later, a sleek woman in a tailored blazer with a clipboard and a Starbucks cup. She introduced herself as Ms. Taylor, led Margaret into a glass-walled office, and began skimming through the resume without even pretending to read it carefully. Margaret Whitmore, 62. Former hotel cleaning staff. Left school after the 8th grade. No recent employment record in the last 3 years. Health conditions, arthritis, low blood pressure. Margaret sat upright, hands folded neatly in her lap. "I'm still able. I don't call out. I work until the job's done." "Why the night shift?" Margaret hesitated. "I préfère the quiet. Less distraction." Ms. Taylor raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. "We're short-staffed on the upper levels. That means you'd be responsible for floors 35 to 40, including the executive suite." "That's fine." Ms. Taylor tapped her pen thoughtfully. "It's usually a security-sensitive area. Not a lot of new people are assigned there. But if you're cleared through background checks, we'll give you a trial shift." Margaret nodded again. By 8 a.m., she was handed a provisional badge, a laminated schedule, and a set of keys that jingled faintly in her coat pocket. She stepped into the service elevator alone. That evening, the building transformed. The bright hustle of daytime gave way to dimmed hallways, echoing floors, and flickering exit signs. The city lights outside sparkled like fireflies, but inside the tower, silence reigned. Margaret moved slowly, her cart squeaking with every turn. The vacuum was heavy, and the mop bucket leaked slightly. Her gloves were too thin for the cold air that lingered in the upper corridors. She paused outside a glass door etched with the words, "Ethan Grant, Chief Executive Officer." The light inside was still on. She bent to wipe a faint streak from the doorknob. As she did, a movement caught her eye. Through the glass, she saw a tall man in his early 30s standing by a whiteboard, marker in hand. Rolled-up sleeves, crisp white shirt, intense gaze. His brow furrowed in concentration. Then he turned to pick up a tablet. That's when she saw it. The scar. A thin, curved burn stretching across his right wrist. Slightly raised. Faintly pink. Decades old. Her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't seen that scar in 30 years, since the last time she held her son's arm, after he'd spilled boiling water while trying to reach the kettle at age 5. The hospital had bandaged it, but the mark remained. She stared frozen, her hand still gripping the doorknob. Suddenly, the man glanced toward the window. Margaret dropped her gaze and hurried down the hall. At the janitor's closet, she leaned against the wall, hand on her chest. It can't be. Her son had vanished from a hospital in 1993. One minute he was in the pediatric wing, and the next, the nurse said he was gone. A man posing as a family member had taken him. The police never found a trace. Her husband had vanished the same day. She filed reports, posted flyers, waited, grieved, then buried her hope. Until now. "Hey lady," a sharp voice called. "You planning to mop or meditate?" Margaret turned to see a blonde woman in heels and a fitted skirt, arms crossed, irritation etched across her face. "I'm Vanessa. Executive assistant to Mr. Grant. We keep this floor spotless, not sentimental." Margaret nodded. "I was just reorganizing supplies." Vanessa smirked.
Make sure you reorganize the fingerprint of the glass too.
This isn't a bus station. She turned and clicked away, her perfume lingering in the air like a slap.
Margaret said nothing.
She picked up the mop and continued down the hall. Around 10:30 p.m., as she emptied the trash near the executive lounge, she noticed something under a side table.
A photograph. All. Slightly bent.
A boy, maybe 5 or 6, standing near a lake. Smiling.
Holding a red ball.
Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. The wrist. That same wrist. That same scar. The hallway swam for a moment. She gripped the edge of the cart to steady herself. Behind her, the security guard Frank approached.
You all right, ma'am?
Margaret looked up, eyes wide. Do you know who dropped this? Frank took a look. Could be Mr. Grant's. He sometimes brings personal stuff for his son. Or it could be left over from cleaning. Margaret swallowed hard. It's familiar. Frank hesitated, then studied her more closely.
Whitmore, right? You from the south side?
Yes. I remember a case years ago. Woman lost her son in a hospital. Just disappeared. I was a younger guard back then. Margaret's throat tightened. It was me, she said softly. My son's name was Thomas. Frank stood silently for a moment. Damn. That's been what, 3 decades?
31 years, Margaret whispered.
She slipped the photograph into her coat pocket. That night, she didn't sleep. The scar. The photo. The age. The face. She wasn't sure yet. But deep down, somewhere beyond reason, she felt it in her bones. She'd found him. Or rather, after all these years. He had found her. The next evening, Margaret arrived at Grant and Locke earlier than usual. Her steps were slower, more deliberate. The photo from the executive lounge was now tucked inside a plastic sleeve, zipped into the lining of her coat. She'd spent the morning studying it under different lights, tracing every inch of the boy's face, comparing it with the single picture she still had of her Thomas. The resemblance wasn't just uncanny, it was exact. The slope of the eyebrows, the way the boy's left eye squinted slightly when he smiled. And that scar. But there was one detail she hadn't noticed until now. On the back of the photograph, in faded penmanship, were the words. Lake Michigan, July 94. Ethan, age 6. Her heart had nearly stopped. Thomas had disappeared in April of 1993. This photo, if real, was taken more than a year later. He hadn't died. He hadn't vanished into thin air. He'd been alive. With a new name. With a new family. Margaret clocked in, pulled her cart from the janitor's closet, and made her way toward the service elevator. As she passed by the security desk, Frank raised his chin in quiet acknowledgement. Rough night? He asked, noticing the strain in her face. Didn't sleep much.
Hesitated.
That picture. The boy, you really think he might be yours? I don't think, she replied. I know. Frank glanced around, then leaned in slightly.
You est very rough the grand adopting a kid.
No. But people like them don't adopt from social services. They don't have to. They have options. Frank nodded grimly. Ethan Grant's parents both passed when he was in his mid-20s. Left him everything. Estate, company shares. No siblings.
No paper trail.
Margaret looked up at the surveillance cameras dotting the ceiling. I need to find out where he came from. What his name used to be. Something. Anything.
Frank hesitated again.
I'm not supposed to help with that kind of thing, you know. I'm not asking for anything illegal, she said. Just, if you see something or hear something. I'll keep an ear out, Frank said, then looked down at her badge.
You're not crazy, Maggie.
But you need to be careful. People up there don't like surprises. She nodded, then stepped into the elevator, heart pounding with a mix of hope and fear. The 38th floor was quiet, just as she liked it. She began her rounds, checking the supply closet, wiping the windows along the hall, sweeping near the conference room. At 8:40 p.m., she reached the executive break lounge. No one was inside. She approached the long polished table and opened one of the drawers, just a routine check for clutter. What she found made her breath catch. A small, red leather notebook, slightly worn along the edges. It had no corporate markings, no initials, no property tag. She hesitated, then opened it. Inside were handwritten notes, sketches of product ideas, meeting times, ordinary things. But halfway through the book, the tone changed. The handwriting became more emotional, more uncertain. One line in particular stood out. Sometimes I wonder where I came from. Not metaphorically. Literally.
I don't remember anything before 6.
My parents told me I was blessed to be chosen. But chosen from where? Margaret read the line 3 times before she closed the notebook. She placed it back exactly as she found it, heart racing. He didn't know. Ethan didn't remember who he really was. He had questions too. At 9:15 p.m., as she finished wiping the glass doors near the boardroom, she saw a shadow through the frosted panel. The door opened, and Ethan Grant stepped out, holding his phone, speaking quietly. Yes, I'm aware of the test result delay. No, I'm not giving up.
Run the cross-reference again. Try the Midwest database.
Narrow it by Chicago, 1990 to 1995. He stopped when he saw her. They locked eyes briefly. Margaret nodded and lowered her gaze, pretending to clean a smudge on the door handle. Ethan gave a polite nod, then continued down the hall. She turned slowly, her knees weak. He was searching. He was looking for someone. Back in the closet, Margaret sat on the overturned mop bucket, staring into the dim light. She whispered to herself.
Thomas.
If that's you, what have they told you? She pulled out the photograph again, now paired with her own, one of Thomas at age 4, sitting on a plastic tricycle outside their old apartment. The likeness was undeniable. But she needed more.
A name change. A birth certificate. A police report. Something tangible.
And if what Frank said was true, if the Grant family had covered up an illegal adoption or paid someone off, there might not be any documents at all. Unless someone else from the past was still alive. The next morning, after her shift, she took the subway to the south side. It had been years since she walked these blocks. Her old building had been torn down. The grocery store replaced by a Starbucks. But one thing hadn't changed.
Walter.
Her ex-husband still lived in the same one-bedroom apartment above the barber shop, a man reduced to shadows. She hadn't spoken to him in over 2 decades. Not since the police told her he'd been questioned about Thomas's disappearance. He claimed he knew nothing. But something inside her had always doubted that. She knocked.
The door creaked open slowly.
The face behind it was pale, sunken, and years older than she remembered.
Margaret.
She nodded. His voice cracked. After all this time, why are you here? She took a long breath. I found him. Walter's expression shifted, from confusion to panic. What are you talking about? I think Thomas is alive. And I think you know how he disappeared. He tried to close the door. She pushed it back with more strength than she thought she had.
Tell-me the truth, Walter.
You owe me that much.
Et hésitated.
Then stepped back, letting her in. The past was no longer a mystery waiting to be solved. It was a secret waiting to be confessed. Walter's apartment smelled of stale tobacco and damp carpet. The windows were yellowed from years of smoke, and the kitchen table was littered with beer cans and unopened mail. Margaret stood near the door, arms crossed, while Walter sat hunched over in a worn recliner, his hands shaking. I didn't think you'd ever come back, he muttered, avoiding her eyes. I wouldn't have, she replied. But I found a photo.
I saw the scar.
I heard his voice.
I can't ignore it anymore.
Walter let out a long breath, closing his eyes.
You don't know what you're stirring up, Maggie.
I'm stirring up the truth, she said. And I'm not leaving until I get it. He reached for a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the floor, took a sip, and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. It was never supposed to happen like that, he began. We were broke. I was drowning in gambling debt. I owed people, real people.
Dangerous ones.
And then, this guy came to me. Said he worked with a private adoption agency. Said he knew couples who'd pay good money. No questions asked. Margaret stared at him, her voice shaking. You're telling me, you sold our son. I thought he'd go to a good family. Rich people.
Saf neighborhood.
I didn't think it'd be forever. You disappeared the same day, she snapped. Left me with empty rooms and a dead phone line.
You let me suffer alone.
Walter looked at her with something like shame. I hated myself for it. Still do.
She stepped closer, voice low.
What was the name of the man who took him? I never knew his real name. He went by Martin.
Drove à Black Lincoln.
Said he was just a broker. I handed Thomas over at the hospital parking lot. He handed me 10 grand in a white envelope.
Dette salée irremembée.
Margaret stared at him for a long moment. Then she turned and left without another word. At the corporate tower that night, Margaret walked the halls with renewed urgency. The ache in her knees had faded beneath the weight of what she now knew. Her son had been taken, sold, renamed. Raised by people who never told him the truth. But what haunted her more was that he was still searching too. She needed proof, something undeniable.
À record, à document, anything.
She thought of the server room. Each floor of Grant & Locke had a restricted access storage area. But the main server archive, a temperature-controlled vault for sensitive digital files, was on the 39th floor. Vanessa Blake had once mentioned it in passing, complaining about the backup protocol delays. Margaret waited until past 11 p.m., when most of the building was empty. She pushed her cart toward the maintenance access hallway, heart pounding. Frank was stationed near the freight elevator. You look like someone with a mission, he said. I need to get into the server room. He blinked.
You're kidding.
I'm not asking you to break rules.
Just, don't stop me.
He looked around, then lowered his voice.
I can't give you the code.
But the system resets to guest access for scheduled cleaning between 11 and midnight. You have 20 minutes before the security logs restart. Margaret nodded. Thank you. She rode the freight elevator up and entered the server corridor. The air was cold, humming with quiet power. Rows of blinking machines lined the walls like glowing sentinels. At the end of the aisle was a glass terminal with biometric access. But next to it was a backup console, an old touchscreen device built into the wall. She pulled out a microfiber cloth, pretending to wipe the screen as she read the login prompt. She typed in guest access _39.
The console blinked. Access granted.
She had no idea what to look for. But she searched keywords adoption, birth records, Grant family, Ethan Grant, 1993, Chicago, hospital. One result flashed, confidential memo, foundational trust transfer. She opened it. It was a scanned letter, dated July 1995. Per private agreement between Martin G. Blackwell and Harold Grant, the child henceforth known as Ethan Harold Grant was placed under full legal guardianship of the Grant household.
Original document sealed.
No agency involved. All inquiries to be redirected to Grant Family Council. She froze.
Martin G. Blackwell. Martin.
That was the name Walter had given. She quickly saved the document to a flash drive she'd hidden in her boot. Then she heard footsteps. She turned just as Vanessa entered the room, holding her phone like a weapon. Funny place to be dusting shelves, Vanessa said coldly. Margaret straightened. I was instructed to clean here during scheduled maintenance.
Vanessa stepped closer. You're not just a janitor, are you? Margaret said nothing.
Vanessa smirked. I know you've been snooping. And I know you've been talking to Frank.
You think you're some kind of tragic mother on a mission.
Margaret met her gaze. He deserves to know. Does he?
Vanessa's eyes hardened.
Because if he finds out, he won't just lose the story he believes. He'll lose his company. His identity. Everything. Margaret didn't flinch. So you'd rather lie to him forever?
Vanessa stepped closer.
Listen carefully. You're one bad rumor away from being thrown out of here. You have no legal rights. No evidence that'll hold up. And people like you? They get crushed by people like me. For a moment, Margaret stared at her, jaw clenched. Then she turned, calmly, and walked out. Outside the building, the wind cut through her coat like ice. She held the flash drive in her palm, fingers trembling. This was proof. This was real. But it was also dangerous. Inside that building were people who would do anything to bury the truth. And her son, her Thomas, now Ethan, was caught in the middle of a lie he didn't even know existed. Back at her apartment, she inserted the flash drive into an old laptop. The document opened again, the signature clear, the seal of the Grant Legal Trust unmistakable. It was all there.
She stared at the name Ethan Harold Grant, until the screen blurred.
Then she began to write a letter.
Note to the press. Note to the police.
To Ethan. Not as an accuser, but as a mother. The letter sat on Ethan Grant's desk unopened. Margaret had slipped it under his office door just before dawn, the envelope plain, her name written in neat cursive across the front. Inside were 2 photographs, one of Thomas as a child, and one of herself holding him, both worn at the edges but still clear, and a single-page letter that began with, "I believe you are my son." But Ethan had yet to arrive. His morning meetings had been delayed, his car rerouted. Someone had changed the internal schedule. Someone had planned it. By 9:40 a.m., Ethan stood alone in the lobby of the top floor, waiting for the elevator. The hallway was unusually quiet. He checked his watch, tapped the call button again. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. The doors slid open, and he stepped in without noticing the faint flicker on the overhead lights or the clicking sound beneath the floor panel.
The doors closed.
Seconds later, the elevator began to descend. And then it stopped. Jerked violently.
Lights flickered.
The cabin shuddered.
Seriously? Ethan muttered, pressing the emergency button.
No response. He pulled out his phone. No service. Suddenly, the lights went out entirely. Margaret had just finished polishing the brass nameplate outside the legal department when she heard the distant clang. It was faint, but sharp, metal on metal. Her instincts kicked in. She hurried toward the stairwell. The emergency lights were glowing red. On the 37th floor, she ran into Frank, who was already talking into his walkie. Elevator 2 has gone offline. It's not responding to reset commands.
Who's inside?
Margaret asked, breathless. Frank looked up, tense.
C'est.
Without hesitation, she turned and started running up the stairs, ignoring the pain in her legs. Frank yelled after her, "Maggie, wait. You can't." But she was already gone. Inside the stalled elevator, Ethan was pacing now. Sweat dripped from his forehead despite the cold. He banged on the door, shouted for help, but the sound barely echoed beyond the steel walls. The air felt thinner. His breathing quickened. Claustrophobia crept in. A tightness in his chest.
He leaned against the wall, attracing.
Then, voices.
Mr. Grant.
Hold on. It was distant, muffled, but real. He pounded on the door. I'm here. Margaret reached the elevator shaft on the 39th floor, where technicians were scrambling with control panels. A supervisor was on the phone with emergency services. She didn't wait. She ran to the service panel and opened the emergency hatch. I used to clean buildings like this. I know how the safety locks work, she said. One technician shook his head. You're not cleared for this. I don't care about clearance. He's running out of air. Frank arrived seconds later, catching up, his face pale with concern. Let her try, he said. We've got 5 minutes at best. They pried open the emergency access. Margaret dropped to her knees and looked down into the narrow crawl space above the elevator. She could see the top of the cabin, and through the vent, Ethan, sitting on the floor, head in his hands. Ethan, she called. He looked up. Who is that?
It's Maggie, the night janitor.
Hang on.
We're getting you out.
He stood unsteadily. Why is this happening? She didn't answer. She didn't know who had done this, but she had her suspicions. Instead, she focused on the latch. She guided the rescue team through the override, talking calmly, clearly. Years of cleaning high-rises had taught her more about elevator systems than most people ever needed to know. Finally, the manual release kicked in. The doors opened 6 inches, then 10. Ethan pushed himself forward, collapsing into the hallway as Margaret and Frank helped pull him out. He coughed, gasping for breath. Paramedics arrived moments later, ushering him onto a stretcher. Before they wheeled him away, he looked up at her, dazed.
You savais de me.
Margaret nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. Hours passed.
Margaret sat in the employee break room, sipping water, en style shaking.
Vanessa walked in, all professional poise and fake concern. I heard you were quite the hero today, she said. Impressive for someone on a cleaning contract. Margaret didn't look at her. You knew that elevator was faulty. Vanessa smiled, cold and unreadable. If I were you, I'd be careful what I accuse people of. Especially without proof. Why would you want to hurt him? Vanessa's smile didn't falter. Sometimes people need to be reminded who's really in control. She turned and left. Later that evening, Margaret was called into Human Resources.
MS. Taylor sat behind the desk, expression irritable.
We've received a formal report regarding your unauthorized access to the server room, she began. And questions have been raised about your presence during today's incident. Margaret remained still.
Il savait d'un man's life.
Yes. And no one is denying that. But this company has protocols. Boundaries.
Are you fearing me?
Ms. Taylor hesitated.
No.
Not yet. But we're placing you on temporary leave until we've completed our review.
Margaret stood slowly, numb. Indistant.
She left the office with her badge deactivated, her keycard revoked. Her letter was still sitting on Ethan's desk, untouched. Ethan sat at home that night, wrapped in a blanket, the lights low. Claire hovered nearby, offering tea, soup, anything he wanted. He waved it off. His mind was elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about the janitor, how calm she had been, how she knew what to do, how her voice had steadied him when panic had set in. He had seen something in her eyes.
Something familiar.
And then there was the envelope. Still sitting unopened. He picked it up, tore the flap carefully, and slid out the contents. The photographs hit him like a wave. The boy was him. No question. But the woman. The handwriting on the letter was soft, deliberate. I don't expect anything.
You only hope you see the truth.
I have nothing to give but the truth. He leaned back, closing his eyes.
Thomas.
His middle name had once been Thomas, according to one sealed document he'd accessed years ago, but he dismissed it then, assuming it was a clerical error. Now it echoed like thunder. He picked up his phone. Vanessa, schedule a meeting. And find out where Maggie Whitmore is staying. The doorbell rang just after 7 the next morning.
Margaret hadn't slept.
Her uniform still hung by the kitchen chair, untouched, her cleaning shoes beside it. The apartment was quiet except for the ticking of the wall clock above the sink and the low hum of her ancient refrigerator. When she opened the door, she found Frank standing there in his work jacket, holding a folded piece of paper. Got something for you, he said, stepping inside. Margaret took the note and read quickly. It was short, only an address and a time.
Ethan Grant. Private residence.
9 a.m. He wants to see me, she asked. Frank nodded. He read your letter. Her throat tightened. Frank looked at her, then added, be careful. I don't know what kind of reception you're walking into. Margaret nodded slowly. I've been preparing for this moment for 30 years.
I'm not turning back now.
The Grant townhouse sat on a quiet block lined with elm trees and black iron fences. Margaret arrived early, wearing a clean coat and carrying nothing but a small envelope with a single folded hospital record, Thomas's birth certificate. It had been amended once, years ago, and then sealed. She had kept the original copy hidden in a book of poems. Claire answered the door. The look in her eyes was not warm. She stepped aside without a word, letting Margaret walk into the high-ceilinged entry hall. Ethan stood near the fireplace, staring at the envelope she'd sent him. He turned when he heard her. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then he gestured toward the couch. Please sit. She did. He remained standing. I read your letter, he said. And I looked at the photographs. Margaret nodded, her hands in her lap. I've spent years trying to trace my origins. I thought I'd come to terms with not knowing. Then you walked into that elevator, and everything I thought I knew started to feel like a lie. I didn't plan any of this, she said softly. I just needed to know if you were really gone. He looked at her, expression hard to read. My parents, Harold and Miriam Grant, told me I was chosen. A gift. They didn't say adoption, but I always knew something was off. My earliest memory is being 6. Before that, nothing. He paused, then added, but you knew about the scar. I was there when it happened, she said. You spilled a kettle.
You were 5.
I wrapped your wrist in a towel and carried you 5 blocks to the clinic. They stitched you up.
The scar never faded.
Ethan looked down at his wrist. He had always thought it was just a childhood accident. But now, even that memory shifted, like a photo fading under sunlight. I need more than stories, he said finally. More than intuition.
You want proof.
I brought this, she said, handing him the envelope. Inside was the birth certificate.
Name, Thomas Whitmore.
Date of birth.
Hospital. Mother, Margaret Whitmore. Father, Walter Whitmore. Ethan read it slowly.
This doesn't prove I'm Thomas, he said. Anyone could have found this and made assumptions.
I understand.
There's one way to know for sure, he said, walking to a side drawer and pulling out a small DNA test kit. I've kept this in the house for years. In case I ever found someone, who might be my mother. Margaret nodded, tears already forming. He handed her the cheek swab, and she completed the test in silence. When she handed it back, Ethan said, I'll send this to my private lab. We'll have results in 48 hours. Claire stepped into the room. Ethan, she said cautiously, we need to talk. In private. He looked between her and Margaret. Anything you have to say, you can say in front of her.
Claire stiffened.
I saw the documents too. And I don't doubt she believes what she says. But think about what this means.
You've built a life, a company. Everything you are.
Is based on a lie, Ethan finished. Claire lowered her voice. If you're not Harold Grant's biological son, you lose majority control.
The board will push you out.
The trust is only valid if you're a blood heir.
Margaret's eyes widened.
I didn't come here to destroy anything. I just wanted you to know the truth. Claire looked at her coldly. Sometimes the truth is too expensive.
Ethan spoke softly.
I'd rather lose everything than live another year not knowing who I am. Claire turned and walked out.
Margaret stood slowly. He should go.
No, Ethan said. Stay. I have questions. They sat at the kitchen table. For the next hour, Margaret told him everything. The apartment they lived in, the lullaby she used to sing, the red tricycle he rode in circles until the wheels wore thin. She told him about Walter. About the debt. About the hospital.
Ethan listened without interruption.
I went to the police, she said. They never found a trail.
No record. Walter disappeared. He lost everything.
He looked at her, eyes softening. And still, you took a job cleaning floors just to get close? I didn't know you were here, she said. Not at first. I only recognized the scar. Then the photo in the lounge.
The pièce started falling into place.
He exhaled, leaned back, ran a hand through his hair. What happens if the test comes back positive? He asked. I don't expect anything, she said.
Not a réunion. Not forgiveness. Just the truth.
Ethan was quiet for a long time. Then he said, let's wait for the results. Then we'll decide what's next. Later that day, Vanessa sat alone in her office, reading an encrypted message on her personal device. DNA test has been initiated.
ID, Margaret Whitmore.
She frowned. She thought she'd taken care of the problem. Thought the elevator scare would slow things down. But now it was accelerating. She picked up her phone and made a call. We might need to intercept the results. She's closer than we thought. She ended the call and leaned back in her chair. Maggie Whitmore was proving to be more resilient than expected. But Vanessa still had one card left to play. And if it worked, Margaret would never see her son again. The DNA test results arrived 2 days later, sealed in an envelope hand-delivered by a private courier from a lab Ethan had used in the past. Discreet, fast, and trustworthy. He sat alone in his study, staring at the envelope like it might explode. The room was silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner and the hum of the heating system kicking on. For a brief moment, he considered not opening it. There was a strange safety in uncertainty. A space where he could still believe he was both things at once, the boy raised by Harold and Miriam Grant, and the boy possibly born to a woman who scrubbed corporate floors at night just to be near him. But truth waited in the envelope, silent and absolute. He broke the seal. 2 lines of text answered every question he had carried for 30 years. Probability of maternity, 99.9987%.
Conclusion, positive biological match. Subject, Margaret Whitmore.
Ethan sat back, the paper trembling in his hand.
She adentelid.
She was his mother. Not metaphorically. Not emotionally. Literally. The boardroom on the 40th floor of Grant & Locke was made of glass and steel, sleek, cold, immaculate. Seated at the long table were the 7 senior board members, their expressions unreadable as Ethan stood at the head of the table, the DNA results in his briefcase. Vanessa sat closest to him, legs crossed, tablet in hand. He cleared his throat. I've called this meeting to discuss a matter that concerns my position here as CEO and my legal standing within the Grant Trust. No one spoke. Only the chairman, a white-haired man named Richard Avery, nodded slightly for him to proceed. Ethan placed the test results on the table. This is a DNA confirmation that I am not the biological son of Harold and Miriam Grant. Murmurs broke out immediately. Vanessa leaned back in her chair, expression carefully blank. I was adopted in 1993, Ethan continued. Privately. No agency was involved. Documents were sealed, and until last week, I had no knowledge of my true origin. And what is your true origin, Mr. Grant? Richard asked. My birth name was Thomas Whitmore.
My mother, Margaret Whitmore, lives in the city.
She worked, for this company as a night janitor. Another ripple of whispers moved around the table. And why bring this forward now? Another board member asked. Surely you understand what this means for the trust. I understand, Ethan said. According to the bylaws, if I am not a direct descendant of the Grant bloodline, I lose my controlling shares. The trust reverts to secondary stakeholders, namely, the Blake family. Everyone turned to look at Vanessa. She smiled politely. I'm as surprised as the rest of you.
Ethan met her eyes.
I don't believe that for a second. Richard interjected.
What are you proposing, Monsieur Grant?
I'm not hiding the truth, Ethan replied. I'm not walking away, either. But I'm invoking Clause 7.2, an internal ethics hearing before any transfer of control. Until then, I retain full authority. Richard leaned back in his chair. Very well. We'll review the clause. In the meantime, we'll expect you to behave accordingly. The meeting adjourned, tension thick in the air. As the room cleared, Vanessa lingered. You've put yourself in quite a position, she said. Truth does that, Ethan replied.
You're gambling with everything.
He turned to her. And you're not. She smiled thinly. The difference is, I play to win. Later that night, Ethan stood outside Margaret's apartment building. She opened the door before he could knock. He didn't speak. He simply held up the paper, the DNA results, and stepped inside. She read the numbers, then looked at him, eyes full of something he couldn't quite name, grief, relief, disbelief. I don't know what to say, she whispered. You don't have to say anything. I missed everything, she said.
Your first word. First step.
School. Graduation. I wasn't there. He shook his head.
You were never gone.
You were stolen from. She reached for his hand.
What happened now?
I don't know, he said. But I'm not walking away. He looked around the apartment, small, quiet, filled with a lifetime of survival.
You deserve better than this.
I don't want anything, she said. I didn't come looking for money or fame. I just needed to know you were okay. He smiled faintly.
You gave me life.
Twice. That counts for something. They sat in silence, the space between them no longer cold or strange. Across town, Vanessa met with a man in an underground parking garage. He handed her a thick file.
This is everything on Margaret Whitmore.
Her employment history, health records, financial debts. She flipped through it quickly. Is there anything damaging? Not really.
She's clean.
But I did find something interesting. Her ex-husband Walter has a criminal record, minor charges, unpaid debts, and a restraining order she filed in 1995. Vanessa smiled. Perfect. She closed the file and slid it into her briefcase.
Time to paint the right picture.
The next morning, a breaking news alert appeared on several financial blogs. Scandal at Grant & Locke, CEO's birth mother linked to fraud and abuse allegations from the 1990s. Ethan saw it moments after waking. Margaret's face, grainy and zoomed in, appeared next to bold headlines. He slammed his laptop shut and grabbed his coat. At the same time, Claire burst into the room, phone in hand.
Have you seen this? The media is all over it.
The board's already calling emergency meetings. Ethan ignored her and walked out the door. Margaret answered on the first knock. Her hands were shaking. I didn't know they'd dig that up, she said. It was all sealed. It was about Walter, not me. I know, Ethan said. I don't care about any of it. But the world will. Let them. He looked at her. They've already tried to bury you once.
You won't let them do it again.
She exhaled, tears running silently down her cheeks. I don't need anyone to believe me, she said.
Allons à judo.
I do, he said. And he meant it. Even if the company slipped through his fingers, even if the world turned its back on them both, he finally knew who he was. And he knew who had given him that truth.
The storm broke at dawn.
It wasn't just the rain pounding the city or the winds rattling the windows of the Grant & Locke Tower, it was the storm inside the building, swelling from whispers to headlines to public outcry. Margaret's face was plastered across business news sites. Phrases like unfit mother, former addict, and abandoned child were thrown around without context, many drawn from distorted fragments of the past that had been exaggerated or outright fabricated. Her work history was dissected, her silence questioned. And the board, now sensing blood in the water, had called an emergency vote. Ethan arrived at headquarters under heavy security. Protesters were already forming outside, cameras flashing as he entered the elevator. Claire had begged him to stay home. You're just making it worse, she said. Every minute this drags on, your stock drops and the Blake family gains leverage. But he didn't care. He'd already made his choice. On the 38th floor, Vanessa stood in front of the server room, phone pressed to her ear. It's set, she said. He'll take elevator 4 as usual.
Just like before.
This time, the override will cut the emergency brake entirely. It'll trigger after floor 30. The voice on the other end spoke low and sharp.
No mistake.
She hung up and slid the phone into her blazer. Her hands didn't shake. Not anymore. Margaret had stayed away from the building for days. After the scandal broke, HR had extended her temporary leave indefinitely. Her badge was deactivated. Her name, once unknown, was now a search result. But that morning, something unsettled her. It was a dream, maybe, or something closer to instinct. A cold knot in her stomach she couldn't shake. She got dressed, pulled her coat tight, and headed downtown. She didn't have clearance anymore, but Frank was on duty. When he saw her at the loading dock entrance, he didn't ask questions. He simply opened the side gate and handed her a visitor's badge. Something's wrong, she said. I know, he replied. Ethan entered elevator 4 at 9:12 a.m.
The doors closed. 36th floor. 35th.
Then a sudden jolt. The cabin shook violently.
Lights flickered.
The floor dropped beneath him. For a moment, everything went still. Then the elevator plummeted. Ethan slammed against the wall as the floor vanished under his feet.
Emergency lights failed.
The override system didn't engage. It was a free fall. In that instant, he didn't see his career flash before his eyes, or the boardroom, or Claire. He saw Margaret. Her hands reaching for his as he collapsed in the hallway weeks ago. Her letter.
Her silence.
Her eyes when she said, "You were never gone. You were stolen from." The elevator slammed to a sudden stop, hitting the emergency brakes on the sub-basement level just seconds before impact. Ethan was unconscious. Margaret was already in the stairwell when the alert came over Frank's radio. Elevator failure. Cabin 4.
No réponse.
No power. She didn't hesitate. She climbed faster than she had in years, pushing her body past every pain and warning. By the time she reached the basement levels, the emergency response team had arrived.
The elevator shaft door was open.
Sparks crackled from severed cables. Water dripped from the ceiling.
And inside, Ethan lay motionless.
His head was bleeding. One arm twisted unnaturally. Pulse is weak, one paramedic said. BP is dropping. He needs blood, another added. Type AB negative. We're out.
Margaret stepped forward.
I'm a match, she said. The doctor hesitated. You've already donated to him once. Your chart shows anemia and low blood pressure. If you do this again, you could suffer permanent damage.
Maybe worse. I don't care. You could die.
She looked at Ethan. He's my son. The hospital was quiet. Margaret lay in a recovery bed, pale and weak, for in her arm. Her breath was shallow, her chest rising and falling with effort. A nurse entered. He's stable, she said. Still unconscious, but stable. Margaret closed her eyes in silent relief. Hours passed. Then a soft voice stirred her.
Maggie.
She opened her eyes. Claire stood at the doorway, arms crossed, face unreadable. I don't know what to say to you, Claire said. Margaret tried to sit up, but Claire gestured for her to stay still. He's alive because of you, Claire said. Twice now. And I still don't know how to feel about that. Margaret spoke quietly. You don't have to feel anything for me. Just protect him.
Claire stepped closer. I saw the footage.
The elevator wasn't a malfunction. It was sabotage.
Vanessa?
Claire nodded.
I believe so.
But without proof, the board won't act. They think it's all coincidence. Margaret looked away. Nothing about this was ever a coincidence. Ethan woke that night.
The hospital room was dim, the machine beeping softly.
He turned his head and saw her. She was asleep in the chair beside his bed, her face slack with exhaustion, a blanket tucked around her. He reached out slowly, his fingers brushing hers. The elevator slammed to a sudden stop, hitting the emergency brakes on the sub-basement level just seconds before impact. Ethan was unconscious. Margaret was already in the stairwell when the alert came over Frank's radio. Elevator failure. Cabin 4.
No réponse.
No power. She didn't hesitate. She climbed faster than she had in years, pushing her body past every pain and warning. By the time she reached the basement levels, the emergency response team had arrived.
The elevator shaft door was open.
Sparks crackled from severed cables. Water dripped from the ceiling.
And inside, Ethan lay motionless.
His head was bleeding. One arm twisted unnaturally. Pulse is weak, one paramedic said. BP is dropping. He needs blood, another added. Type AB negative. We're out.
Margaret stepped forward.
I'm a match, she said. The doctor hesitated. You've already donated to him once. Your chart shows anemia and low blood pressure. If you do this again, you could suffer permanent damage.
Maybe worse. I don't care. You could die.
She looked at Ethan. He's my son. The hospital was quiet. Margaret lay in a recovery bed, pale and weak, for in her arm. Her breath was shallow, her chest rising and falling with effort. A nurse entered. He's stable, she said. Still unconscious, but stable. Margaret closed her eyes in silent relief. Hours passed. Then a soft voice stirred her.
Maggie.
She opened her eyes. Claire stood at the doorway, arms crossed, face unreadable. I don't know what to say to you, Claire said. Margaret tried to sit up, but Claire gestured for her to stay still. He's alive because of you, Claire said. Twice now. And I still don't know how to feel about that. Margaret spoke quietly. You don't have to feel anything for me. Just protect him.
Claire stepped closer. I saw the footage.
The elevator wasn't a malfunction. It was sabotage.
Vanessa?
Claire nodded.
I believe so.
But without proof, the board won't act. They think it's all coincidence. Margaret looked away. Nothing about this was ever a coincidence. Ethan woke that night.
The hospital room was dim, the machine beeping softly.
He turned his head and saw her. She was asleep in the chair beside his bed, her face slack with exhaustion, a blanket tucked around her. He reached out slowly, his fingers brushing hers. She woke, startled, then smiled weakly. "You're here," he whispered.
So are you.
He closed his eyes, then opened them again. "I saw her," he said.
Vanessa.
Just before the elevator dropped. She was watching me. She knew.
I believe you.
I almost died. But you didn't. He looked at her.
Because of you.
The next morning, Ethan called a press conference. He stood at the podium, arm in a sling, forehead bandaged, but voice steady. "I have something to say," he began. "About who I am. About where I come from." The cameras clicked. Reporters leaned forward. "I am not the biological son of Harold and Miriam Grant. I was adopted under circumstances that were never disclosed to me. For years, I searched for answers. And a few weeks ago I found them, in the most unexpected place." He looked toward the front row, where Margaret sat beside Claire, quiet and composed.
My mother, my real mother, is Margaret Whitmore.
She is not a socialite. She is not wealthy. She is not famous. She is a janitor.
She is the woman who saved my life.
Twice. And the woman who gave it to me in the first place. He paused. I don't care what that costs me. Because what I've gained is something no title or trust fund can replace, the truth. He stepped away from the podium. The room was silent. Then, one by one, people began to applaud.
Slowly, at first.
Then rising, until the chamber filled with the sound of hands meeting in unity. Margaret remained still. But inside, something unbroken stirred. After all these years, her son had found his voice. And it was strong enough to drown out the lies. The morning after the press conference, the world was still catching its breath. News outlets ran the story under bold headlines: CEO reveals true identity. Biological mother is company janitor. Talk shows speculated, analysts debated the implications for Grant and Locke, and social media flooded with hashtags like #TruthOverTitles and #MotherOfTheSue. But inside the hospital, things were quieter. Ethan sat beside Margaret's bed, a cup of coffee going cold in his hand. She was stronger now, enough to sit up, enough to walk with help. Her blood levels were recovering, though doctors insisted on at least 2 more days of monitoring. He looked at her, studying her profile in the pale morning light. Her eyes were closed, but her hand rested near his, fingers twitching slightly every now and then, like they still needed to hold something after all these years of letting go. "You know," he said quietly, "there was a time when I used to imagine what my mother looked like. It wasn't often. But when I did, I pictured someone who smiled like you do." Margaret opened her eyes slowly. "I used to imagine you too," she replied.
Every night, for years.
Then just some nights. Then only when it rained. Eventually, only when I passed a little boy in the street." He smiled gently. "I'm sorry it took this long."
You came back. That is enough.
They sat in silence for a while. Then Ethan said, "There's something I have to ask. It's about Claire." Margaret's expression shifted slightly.
She's afraid, Ethan.
Afraid of losing what she built with you. I don't blame her for that. But she hid the first DNA test. She knew. Before I did.
Margaret hesitated.
That wasn't right. But fear makes people do terrible things. "I want to believe she did it for love," he said. "But I can't ignore what it cost you." "She gave me a seat at your side when she didn't have to," Margaret said. "She stood with me at that press conference. That counts for something." Ethan nodded slowly. "I'm trying to forgive her," he said. "But trust doesn't grow back overnight." "No," Margaret said. "It grows the way we did, quietly, through storms." Claire sat in the garden behind their townhouse, her phone buzzing with unanswered messages. Her parents had called. Her lawyer had called. The PR firm had called 3 times. She hadn't answered any of them. When Ethan arrived, she looked up without expression. I didn't think you'd come. I had to. He sat across from her, letting the silence stretch between them. Claire spoke first. I thought I was protecting you. And maybe a little bit, I was protecting me too. You were, he said. From something you thought might break us. I knew what that letter said the day it was left on your desk. I opened it. I read it. I panicked.
You buriez the truth.
I did. She folded her hands, then looked up at him. I'm not proud of it. But I love you. And I thought, if she took you away, there'd be nothing left for me.
Ethan leaned forward.
She didn't take anything. She gave me something I didn't even know I was missing. Claire's eyes filled with tears. I was scared I wouldn't be enough. You are, he said. But now we have to live with the truth. All of it. She nodded. I'm willing to try.
Vanessa was less willing.
She stormed into her office that afternoon, phone pressed to her ear, voice low and sharp. What do you mean the data logs are gone? The man on the other end spoke nervously. Security systems were wiped. Someone from internal IT initiated a rollback before the elevator incident. We're looking into it, but you had one job, Vanessa hissed. Cover the breach.
Delete the control override.
Now there's a gap in the system pointing right at me.
She hung up, furious.
Then she turned, and found Frank standing in the doorway. You shouldn't leave your door unlocked, he said casually.
Vanessa froze.
Frank held up a flash drive. You wiped the official logs. But you forgot about the backup server.
Every elevator override, command run, a duplicate timestamp true maintenance review. Heure expression darkened.
That's not admissible. It's not even on the mainframe. It's enough, Frank said. And I already gave a copy to Ethan.
She stepped forward slowly. Do you know what you're doing?
Keeping someone from killing the man who finally did the right thing.
Frank left without another word. Vanessa stared at the door.
She wasn't used to losing. But she could feel the walls closing in. That evening, Ethan returned to the hospital. He found Margaret sitting up, dressed, her hair brushed back. You look ready to go, he said. They said I could leave tomorrow, she replied. Good. I was hoping you'd come home with us. She blinked.
With you and Claire.
And Lucas, he added. He's been asking about you every day. Margaret smiled. I don't want to cause any more disruption. You're not a disruption, he said. You're family. She looked down at her hands. I don't know how to be a mother to a grown man. Then be a grandmother to a little boy, he said. That's a good start. She chuckled, then nodded.
Idée like that.
That night, Ethan sat at his desk, staring at the photo he'd kept hidden for years, a picture of himself as a child on the shore of Lake Michigan. The same photo Margaret had found in the executive lounge. For the first time, it made sense. He wasn't lost anymore. He reached into the drawer and pulled out the red leather notebook where he'd once written questions he never thought he'd answer. He opened to the middle, and beneath the line "Where did I come from?" he added a new one.
From the on off a woman who never stopped waiting.
He closed the notebook. Tomorrow, the board would vote on whether he remained CEO. Tomorrow, Vanessa would be exposed. Tomorrow, the world would change again. But tonight, for the first time in 31 years, he wasn't afraid of who he was. He knew his name. He knew his story. And he knew the woman who had waited a lifetime to tell it to him. The boardroom was unusually silent. 10 members sat around the long table, each with a copy of the security report in front of them. The sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across polished wood. At the head of the table, Ethan stood tall in a dark suit, his sling now gone, the scar on his forehead still healing. He cleared his throat, holding up a flash drive. This, he said, contains the duplicate server logs from our maintenance backup system. It records a manual override of Elevator 4's emergency brakes on the day I was nearly killed. He plugged it into the room's central display. On the screen, a time-stamped sequence appeared, showing access initiated from Vanessa Blake's credentials, minutes before the incident. The room was still. Then came the murmur. Richard Avery, the board chairman, adjusted his glasses. Miss Blake, do you have a response? Vanessa, seated at the far end, didn't flinch. Her hands rested calmly in her lap. I was framed. Ethan tilted his head. You expect us to believe someone stole your credentials, accessed a restricted override, and had motive to eliminate me, all without your knowledge? She shrugged slightly. People underestimate the ambition of those below them. Then explain this, Ethan said, clicking to the next screen, surveillance footage from the server hallway showing Vanessa exiting moments after the override. Her face changed. Slightly. Just enough. Is this really how you wanted to win? Ethan asked. I did what I had to do, she said. You were never one of us. You don't belong at the top of this company, let alone in the Grant family legacy.
You were a mistake.
An orphan plucked from obscurity. Ethan stepped forward.
No.
I was a child stolen from his mother. And raised in a lie.
Vanessa stood.
And yet, everything you have came from that lie. You built your life with their money, their name.
Don't prétends you're above it.
I'm not above anything, Ethan said. But I won't protect what's corrupt.
Not anymore. Richard reste à onde.
Enough. Miss Blake, you are hereby suspended, pending legal review.
Security will escort you from the building.
Vanessa's jaw tightened. She turned to Ethan one last time. You think this is redemption, she said coldly. It's collapse. And it's coming for you next. She walked out without another word. That evening, Ethan met Margaret at the old church where she used to volunteer. It was quiet inside, the stained glass windows casting soft colors on the pews. She was sweeping the floor, humming to herself. You still do this? He asked, walking in. She turned, smiling. I find peace in places others forget. He approached her.
Vanessa is gone.
The board's shifting. I might lose control of the company soon. The lawyers are still arguing over bloodline clauses and shareholder rights. Margaret leaned on her broom. And how do you feel? He thought for a moment. Free. She nodded. Then it's worth it. I've spent so long trying to protect what they gave me, he said. But maybe the real legacy isn't about ownership. It's about what we build next. She looked at him. So what will you build? Ethan smiled.
Something real.
3 days later, the board convened for a final vote. Richard Avery stepped to the microphone during a press release and announced that Ethan Grant would retain his executive position, with limited voting power, while the trust structure underwent legal review. The public responded with overwhelming support. Investors remained stable. And the company's image, thanks to Ethan's honesty, rose higher than it had in years. But Ethan knew none of that mattered as much as what he was about to do next. At a press conference, he stood beside Margaret, Claire, and Lucas. I'd like to announce the creation of the Whitmore Foundation, he said. A new wing of Grant & Locke dedicated to supporting low-income families, janitorial staff, single parents, and forgotten workers, the very people this company depends on, but rarely sees. He looked at Margaret. This foundation is named after the woman who gave me life, not just by birth, but by example. She reminded me of something we all forget, that greatness isn't found in titles. It's found in sacrifice. The applause was thunderous. Margaret didn't say anything. She just reached for his hand and held it. Meanwhile, Frank stood outside the courthouse, reading a brief headline, Vanessa Blake indicted on charges of attempted manslaughter and corporate sabotage. He folded the paper, exhaled, and walked away. He didn't need recognition. He'd done what mattered. And for once, someone like him had made a difference. Walter Whitmore, sitting alone in his apartment, watched the press conference on a flickering TV. He turned up the volume, hearing Ethan speak the name Whitmore in front of the entire world. He stared at the screen. Then he turned it off. For the first time in decades, he didn't reach for a bottle. That night, back at Ethan's home, Lucas crawled onto Margaret's lap, holding a book. Read this one, Grandma, he said. She opened it, smiling. Her voice was soft, steady, a little hoarse from years of silence, but it was strong enough to carry through the room. Ethan sat on the couch, watching them. Claire brought him tea and sat beside him, their hands brushing. Think he'll remember her? Claire asked. He'll never forget her, Ethan said. And neither will I. Later, alone in his study, Ethan opened the red notebook one last time. On the final page, he wrote,
Not everything broken stay broken. Some things survive. Some things return.
And some things, like love, refuse to be forgotten. He closed the notebook, placed it on the shelf, and turned out the light.
The house was quiet.
But the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of everything that had once been lost. And now, finally, was found. Spring came late to Chicago that year, but when it arrived in full. Dogwoods blooming along the sidewalks, sunlight stretching into the early evening, and the sharp chill in the air finally giving way to a breeze that smelled of rain and concrete and something close to hope. Margaret stood at the edge of the rooftop garden atop Grant and Locke's headquarters, watching the city move below. The sounds of traffic were distant from here, muted. The garden had been Claire's idea, a quiet space built in honor of the janitorial staff and maintenance workers, with benches named after those who had served the company for more than 20 years. One of those benches now bore the name Margaret Whitmore, Steward of the Unseen. She ran her fingers along the engraving, eyes misting. Behind her, the door opened. Ethan stepped out, dressed simply, no suit, no tie.
Just a white shirt and dark jean, like anyman on a Saturday morning.
He handed her a paper cup of coffee. No cream, 2 sugars, he said.
Still the same.
Still the same, she said, smiling softly. They sat together, the city stretched wide before them. You know, he said, a year ago I thought I had everything. Margaret looked at him. And now? I realize I had a lot. But not everything. He turned to her. Now I have everything. Margaret didn't answer, only reached over and placed her hand over his. They sat in silence, letting the wind fill the space with meaning. The Whitmore Foundation launched officially in early May. Its mission was clear: provide healthcare, childcare, and emergency housing support to underpaid workers in major corporations. The first grant was awarded to a janitor who'd lost his home in a fire. The second went to a single mother who needed a wheelchair-accessible van for her son. Ethan insisted the foundation remain independent from the board's control. No suits in the decision room, he said. Only those who've cleaned them. Margaret declined a formal title, but she visited the office weekly, offering guidance, reviewing applications, and listening, really listening, to people who were used to being passed over. One afternoon, as she walked through the foundation's new space, a young custodian named Jerome stopped her near the elevator. You really used to work here? He asked, half disbelieving. Night shift, she said.
35th to 40th floor.
For almost 2 years. And now you're the reason my daughter's getting her surgery. Margaret smiled. Sometimes you get to hold the door open for the next person through. Jerome looked at her for a moment, then said, My mom used to say that kindness leaves a trail. Guess you proved her right. Back at home, Claire was rebuilding her relationship with Ethan, not out of necessity, but out of choice. They'd spent long nights in the kitchen talking, unwrapping the years they'd spent hiding behind ambition and reputation. Margaret had become a regular presence in their lives, quietly anchoring the new rhythm of family.
Lucas adorait d'heure.
He would run to her after school, arms flung wide, yelling Grandma Maggie, at full volume. They read stories, baked cookies, and worked in the small garden Ethan had built behind the townhouse. One day, Lucas asked her, Grandma, were you always a grandma?
Margaret looked.
No, honey.
Used to be a little girl once.
Did you have a grandma? I did, she said, looking out the window. She used to tell me, the ones who go missing aren't always lost. Sometimes they're just waiting to be found.
Lucas blinked.
That's what happened to Daddy, right? She smiled. That's exactly what happened. As summer neared, the company shifted. Ethan no longer fought for control in the old ways. He stepped down as CEO, appointing a leadership team that reflected the real workforce: women, immigrants, people from working-class backgrounds. He took a new title, Director of Legacy and Reform. The press called it radical. Ethan called it overdue. He focused on mentoring, policy, outreach. He traveled to schools, spoke at shelters, partnered with unions. His name was no longer just Ethan Grant. It was also Thomas Whitmore. He signed both names now. One for the man he became. One for the boy who was never really gone. In early July, Margaret received a letter in the mail. It came from a nursing home in Indiana. The return address had no name, but she recognized the handwriting immediately.
Walter.
She hadn't spoken to him since the day she confronted him decades ago. Not after the court had quietly reopened a file and formally exonerated her from all negligence claims. Not after his silence through Ethan's rise. She opened the letter with steady hands. I saw your face on TV. You didn't look angry. You looked proud.
I don't know if I deserve forgiveness.
But if there's anything left in me worth saving, it's because I once knew you. There was no request. No apology. Just a man alone with his regret. She folded the letter and placed it in her drawer. She would not answer it, not yet. Some wounds did not need words to close. Just time. On a warm August morning, Margaret walked with Ethan through a neighborhood she hadn't visited in years. They passed the corner where she used to wait for the bus. The bakery that no longer existed. The playground where Ethan, no Thomas, had once fallen and scraped his knee. They stopped outside their old apartment building, now renovated and renamed.
You êtes to live in DC, she said.
You had a bed near the window. You used to press your face to the glass and wave at every car that passed. Ethan stood beside her, silent. I don't remember it, he said. You don't have to, she replied.
You came back to it in your own way.
He looked at her.
Can I tell you something?
Of course. You saved me, he said, even when I didn't know I needed saving. Margaret nodded.
And you saved me.
From giving up. They stood there for a while, letting the city move around them, two shadows returning to a place where everything had once ended, and where something had finally begun again. That night, as the sun set over the skyline, Margaret stood at her window and looked out at the city. There was no more searching.
No more waiting. No more fear.
Only light.
And the long, steady rhythm of belonging.
She didn't need to be remembered in statues or speeches. She was remembered in the face of a man who carried her blood. In the laugh of a grandson who carried her heart. And in the quiet truth that sometimes, the people we overlook are the ones who hold everything together. Not with power, but with love.